We're going to talk about Sex by Cory Silverberg and Fiona Smith. We're going to discuss diversity and how to celebrate diversity in the workplace, in the classroom, in everyday life by presenting the case of the values of sexuality, of gender, of race, and the construction of identity, who you are and what you stand for, and where you are developed and how you continue to grow and build and evolve or adapt and transform in the future, and how to celebrate that, not just in yourself, in your community, in your kindred environment, but also beyond. How to understand people and work with people through the difficulties, through the challenges, and through the struggles. We're going to break down this textbook that Cory and Fiona wrote. And we encourage you to get the textbook and buy a puzzle. And with this puzzle, as you read this book, meditate, get affirmations, get confirmations on what it means to have 1,000-piece puzzle, and then put the puzzle pieces together and tape it when you're done so you can see the picture and all the puzzle pieces you had to fit together, and how the world is symbolism of diversity. We are interconnected. We are interdependent, just like this puzzle and the 1,000 pieces, and how the fragmentation, how they come together in a certain way, the way that the cuts of the piece to fit perfectly, but it has to be in a certain way, a certain technique, in a certain format, a certain model. Is not defective. It is not dysfunctional. It's not destructive, but it's constructive. It is cut in a perfect precision. So it is like life. Life is diversity. Diversity is value. It is celebration. So you have to understand how to put things together. Diversity, put things together. So with that said, we have 11 chapters. We're going to talk about what is sex, what is the bodies, what is gender, what is puberty, what is your feelings, consent, talking, how to communicate, relationships, reproduction, touching, and safety. So we're going to just take each session. I'm not going to do the whole session, about 12 different chapters. We're just going to break it down to one chapter at a time. This conversation is the introduction to this textbook, to this course, lecture, and coaching session and training session. So we do the triple threat: coaching, teaching, and training. And mentorship is kind of like with the training. So with that said, we will be working through the textbook, Cory and Fiona, and talking about sexuality, talking about the consuming relationship of sexuality. We're going to talk about diversity and how that plays a role in sexuality and consuming the relationship, the time consuming, the commitment, the interaction of building relationships, and how that is part of the factors of sexuality, how relationships are built, whether they're healthy or they're dysfunctional or defective or destructive or constructive. We will discuss the elements of relationships and how sexuality plays an important role to healthy relationships. And what does it mean to be in a healthy relationship in the workplace, in the relationships, personal, publicly, like as in school or in the public environment, going to a different store or a business or restaurant to eat? How do you interact with difficult people, challenging people, unhealthy people? How to interact with different relationships and how to embrace it, how to be empowered with it? How do you have empathy? How do you have safe space? These are all part of the factors, or we call variables of the holistic approach of relationships. So let's begin with what is sex. Sometimes people get all spooked out when you talk about sexuality, right? You go sex class, like, ooh wee, I don't want my kid doing sex class. But if you look at it, sexuality begins from the birth, from the womb, because when you come into the world, you come into a world of systems. These systems put us into categories. These categories reminds us of taxonomy with animals and plants and wildlife and wilderness, right? And this category sometimes keeps us in this box, right? This box tells us what we are and how we think and how we should act in the social normalcy of life, behavior and conduct and performance, right? It's practice, repetition, learned behavior, habits. These are all the factors and variables that build what we call sexuality, what build our identity, our personalities, not just genetics, not just family relationships, how we were built from, baby to childhood into youth. These are factors that come together just like a cake and with ingredients. One ingredient do not make the cake alone, but it's a part of the cake. But the cake itself is the chemistry of all these factors. And sexuality is the same way. It's all of the factors that consume and be put in the cake, and then you bake that ingredients that made a chemistry, and then the finalization, which is the process to the cake. Before it's done, you have to watch it elevate. You have to watch it rise from the being heated and pressured. And then when you come out, you have a cake and you have to let it sit. And before you put the icing on, these are the things that we talk about when we talk about the holistic approach to sexuality, a holistic approach to relationships, a holistic approach to who we are as an identity. It doesn't start with just our choices and free will, how we create our experiences, how we choose what we want to do or what we do not want to do. A lot of these things come from factors and ingredients that has built a compatibility or chemistry from our environment, from our community, from our interaction, what kind of messages that we're getting, what kind of responses, and how we respond to that with the attitude, with the conduct and behavior, and how it was taught to us, what we was able to recall and retain from our muscle memory. So these are all of the things that we will be talking about in this term. So let's begin. So the letter from to the reader is from Cory, and he starts like this. Thank you for picking up our book. Learning about bodies, gender, sex, and puberty is different than learning about other things. It is not because those topics are bad, weird, strange, or uncomfortable. We just don't talk about them nearly as much as we talk about things like movies, video games, music, or sports. So I wanted to point out a few things before you start reading this book. Some people think sex education is a science lesson, like there's only one right answer to each question. That's not how we wrote this book. We're guided by something like disability justice organizer and artist Patty Burney says there's no right or wrong way to have a body. If something in this book doesn't fit for you, it isn't your fault or your problem. You have not, I'm sorry, you may have ways of thinking and feeling that we left out. You may be left with more questions than answers. I know I feel that way a lot of the time. This book is a lot. There's funny stuff and fascinating stuff, but also a lot of hard stuff, like talking about discrimination and violence. If something you're reading feels like too much, take a break from for an hour a week, a month, or a year. Learning doesn't happen quickly. You know best what you can handle and when, and trusting your instincts is what this book is all about. So if you come across a question or activity in the book and it doesn't feel right, skip it or come up with your own question or activity. This book is for adults too. Most adults didn't have the opportunity to think and talk about sex and gender when they were younger. There will be things in this book that are new for adults. There will be other things they don't expect to find in a book for young people, like pregnancy, loss, and trauma. If you know an adult who is open to reading this book with you, remind them that they may need time before they are ready to talk about some of what they learn here. It took Fiona and me 7 years to make this book. I hope you find some things in it that are helpful, funny, interesting, challenging, and useful. Our books get better when readers let us know both what worked for them and also what didn't. If you have thoughts or questions about anything in this book, please be in touch. You can find me through my website, www.corysilverberg.com. So this is the introduction, the letter from the author to the reader. Now, there's some beautiful pictures, illustrations in this book, so I would recommend you to buy it. But we're going to just use this book as a coaching model and teaching model and training model to mentor you through sexuality. So we start with page 14, and you have a girl in bed named Mimi, and then you have a boy in bed named Omar, and you have two we call it bunk beds of people, looks like siblings named Cooper, and then you have Zai as the characters of this book, and then you have the pictures of them in school, and they find a note in one of these, I guess, stuffed animals they using as a owl, a education owl named Herbert. And so the question is, what is a slut? So someone put in their questions for sex education to have a conversation. And so there's 3 questions. What is a slut? How do gay people have sex? And my cousin watches porn all the time. So when you think about these 3 questions, we're going to start there. In this sex education questionnaire, these are what a lot of inquiries from children. They want to know these things because they're not developed yet. They haven't learned these habits of adults yet. So they want to understand some of these conversations that adults have because they're just copying and like sponges. But some children want to know, why are they copying these behaviors, these conducts, these learned behaviors before they actually put into practice as a habit. So you have these different levels of consciousness. And when we talk about the question, what is a slut? This question came from probably a person, a youth that is around adults who have this conversation, that's where they usually get it first, is at home. If they don't get it from home, they get it from media, TV, music. Sometimes they might get it from their environment, listening to adults having conversations, or they might be a child who have these conversations. But here it is. What is a slut? Now, if we had a conversation about this question, we would have developed the history of why this derogatory term is a social normacy conversation. What is a slut? We would talk about how in the 1940s and 30s, the way the culture of family, of community had esteem, like how they saw the person as a woman. This is called gender. How they had sexuality, how women were seen. Why were they called sluts? Why were men called sluts? What was the root word or the root history of this conversation? We don't recognize this, but sometimes you see race, the construction of race. Whereas when you had slavery in the United States, and they used to breed not just animals, but they had bred humans. People don't realize that humans was being breeded or bred like they did with dogs and cats and animals when they had full-blooded breeded animals that they wanted to duplicate. So where does the word slut come from? Where did it begin? Where's the origins of this word? We're talking about this because this is part of this textbook conversation, how youth have these different conversations because they've heard it in their circles. They don't really understand it because they don't know the history. They don't have the research done of why humans or why people, why the environment learned these behaviors and passed them on to them. They're trying to figure out why do they have to do this. Just like the other day, I heard someone said, why do we have to do math? I remember a season, a time when I said that, and now I get it because I do social mathematics, equality mathematics, and infinite mathematics with algorithms. When you start developing the understanding of math, you understand why they used to teach math all the way to calculus. The reason why for social economics, social mathematics, because you apply these factors and numbers and formulas to social behavior, social conduct, social performance. Social behavior means, what does society have accepted? What did society have deemed worthy? Even though it may not be civility in the future, but what is it at the present moment, and how did it affect us in the past? Like, for instance, legal slavery. Legal slavery is much like our 21st century legalized prisons, legalized medication from opium, right? These are legalized products or systems that in the future may see it as dysfunction and defective and underdeveloped, because slavery was a very atrocious atrocity. Now into 21st century, it's called workforce, because now you get paid under deserved, or you don't get paid for what you're worth. So now you have this type of slavery that is not barbaric, right? It is half barbaric, because some people get paid $1 a day to work 19 hours, when some people get paid $4 an hour and they work 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day. Some people make $20 an hour, but The top 12, 15% may make $15,000 to $100,000 a day. So what is that called? It's called a sliding scale in a socialist society. You have a sliding scale. People are afraid to call our capitalism socialism because they think that it's fair to have competition. But in reality, it's not fair, right? It is very biased because you have a sliding scale. You have some people that have and some people that have not. So when you have a universal law, which means everybody work, some people get undeserved, undervalued, and some people get overvalued. And that is the universal law for work, which was used to be called slavery. So why do I bring that up? Because that's what we're talking about: sexuality and gender roles and construction of race. I should say construction of gender, construction of sexuality, construction of race. Everything is a construction. Why do I call things construction? Because it has to be developed. It has to be made. It has to be what you call innovative or inventive, right? Nothing we are in this world as a human did not come through math. And that's why math was important, because math showed you that there's an infinite timeline because of infinite calculus, infinite math. You wouldn't know that you can create things on an infinite timeline without infinite mathematics. You don't know how to be a social construct being on the infinite timeline. So if you only had, arithmetic or natural numbers, you wouldn't have an infinite timeline. You will have a finite timeline. So you can't understand how to be a human being for 1,000 years or 1,000,000 years or an infinite number of years, because your mind can't comprehend that, because it doesn't know social mathematics. That's why you need math to understand that timeline, so that when you create products and services and systems, you create on an infinite timeline instead of a finite timeline. That's called mathematics. And how far you can count is how far you can develop. So if you only can count to 10, you only can develop to 10. But if you can count to 1,000,000, you can develop a potential to 1,000,000. So that's what math is for. It's to help you stretch your muscles. It helps you grow into that space. So now let's talk about sexuality. How does this correlate, or how does this relate to each other? Sexuality is the same thing. If you don't have the information, you only can work with what you have. If you don't have anything, you don't have nothing to work with. And so here you have a youth that was working with what is a slut. So that tells me, just by that question, that youth is working on a environment and a family dynamics with a community that is teaching that child that women and men are nothing but a product. They're property. They're made to have ownership or to be up under ownership. They're inferior. Their humanity is not valued. That question comes with a weight of truth, of facts, of background information. So when you're sitting there telling this child or youth that asks this question, what is a slut? You're correcting some of the behavior that is being imprinted on that youth through construction, right? How they construct their identity is to understand the way people behave and the way they use math or the way they interact with life or don't interact with life. And then you have to also remember the factors and the kind of the intersections of Invisible factors, let me use an example of invisible factors, is their upbringing, what's done in secret, what's done in privacy, what's done in the mind and thoughts, how they're developed on how to be disciplined, their construction of motivation, whether it's through not having enough food, having too much food, wasteful, and being told that's okay. It's all of these processes that make up this chemistry that built that person. And then we're not even digging into trauma, injury, disability, and then the way they view these things and their environment views these things. So we have to talk about these things like we do with sports. When you talk about sports, you talk about the plays, the off, the on, you talk about the defense, the offense, you talk about each player, their stats, you talk about how many runs they made, how many steals they made. You can completely embrace the sport and then engage and commit to learning everything about the conduct and behavior of the athlete. It's all the way up to the officials, the referees, and the coaches. You will even pay attention to the time, how much time they have left on the clock. These are all of the elements of sports. It's no different for sexuality and humanity. Sexuality is just like sports. You have to understand it through developing the details, the stats, the in and out, offense, defense plays, the personalities, meaning the character, or as we could say, the player that's involved. You have all these elements, invisible and visible. Then you have the intersections, which is the interactions, like the officials interact with the athletes, like the off lineman interaction with the athletes, the coaches, how they interact with the athletes, the fans, how they interact with the athletes. Same thing with the sexuality and the environment, the community, the workplace, as well as this classroom. They all are interactions with the person that's considered as the athlete. So what does that mean about sexuality? When you explain some youth or adult what is a slut, you're talking about a learned behavior. You're talking about a conduct of social normalcy through the mathematics of inequality. Because the equality mathematics will say, what is a person? See, what is a slut? It shows that one, you have no value for the person because the slut is a derogatory term as someone that's been belittled, someone that has been less valued, someone that has been put down into shame. So you have stripped away dignity, stripped away respect, because now you have classified a category of a slut, defined it in a derogatory stigmatization, criminalized it and demonized it. So now the word slut does not mean person, doesn't mean athlete, doesn't mean the universal words of player, meaning sports, athlete. See, you can't barely use the word player anymore because it has a derogatory term for slut. So now you're asking yourself the universal term, which is athlete, participant, to now the terminology of derogatory of slut, meaning inferiority, stigmatization, right? These are the categories that is put in place by systems, people that understands behavior. So they create systems to categorize these behaviors so they can identify how to react or respond to it. This is what we call a hierarchy or hegemony. We have power structures that do not want to play equality, like equality mathematics. What goes up comes down. It's equal. They both have the same sides. It's no stigmatization. There's no sliding scale because what comes up, what goes down, right? So the sliding scale is causing people to have derogatory excuses or to legalize derogatory, legalize stigmatization, legalize the things that victimize people because they're now in a category of inferiority, like criminals or crime. That's a derogatory of less importance or not as valued, right? Than someone that does not have a criminal background. So why is this problematic when it's legalized like they did with chattel slavery? Things are legalized to give people the excuse and the privilege to protect these excuses to devalue people, to dehumanize people, and to play a role in people's lives that will break them instead of build them. So when you talk about what is a slut by this youth, you're basically trying to make it simple and light and superficial so that it will not be depressing. And then you got to deal with mental health because reality can be negative, just like math. It can have results of negativity. So sometimes having this opportunity to protect defects and defective systems, you start with covering up the truth and covering up the performance stats of the truth. So what do I mean with that? When we play sports, you show the stats, even if it's bad, good, or ugly, because it's universal law for sports and athletes to have their stats. The high paying ones to the low paying levels, they show their stats. But in society, the system's created disenfranchise people and create a system where they protect their derogatory behavior so they can keep their status. And in that, inequality is born. Environmental injustice is born because they're protecting the hierarchy. They're protecting the models. They're protecting the things that is considered as derogatory and ineffective. So we're going to move on to the second question. How do gay people have sex? And the third question, my cousin watches porn all the time. Sex education. So we're going to take a break and just sit with what is a slut. And the next time we're going to talk about the reason why we want to relearn or unlearn and relearn is because we don't have the right to take away someone's dignity. We don't have the right, even if we are legalized to do it, just like slavery was done, it's still not a right to be cruel or provide unsafe environments. People don't have a right to take safety away. Even though they do take it away, still it's not a righteous law. It's not an ethical approach to humanity. So this is Dr. Coach K in the conversation of what is a slut, in the sexual education of sex, and by Cory and Fiona. And we will prepare our session 2 another time. In the meantime, go buy you a puzzle get a 1,000-piece puzzle and start putting puzzle pieces together, thinking about this conversation about sexuality and what it means to be in a sexual life in a world that treats sexuality as property and not as personality. Once again, this is Coach K. One love, much love, all love. Peace and blessings. Signing off.